And we didn't really do this, but this is this brain. I die, okay? And so you take my brain and you fill all of the ventricles, the holes in my brain, with gray plastic, okay? All right? Then you use acid and you dissolve all of the brain tissue around it, and what you're left with is just the shape of the ventricles that you filled with gray plastic, okay? Now, in real life, these are spaces that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. But what you're looking at right now is just gray plastic because that's what you put in those ventricles, okay? So are you good with what you're looking at? Okay, all right. So there are 4 ventricles and lots of connectors between those holes in your brain, okay? So this one is the right lateral ventricle, and this one is the left lateral ventricle. Check out the shape. It has a C shape with a tail, okay? So I remember that because it's like C for cat, and cats have tails, okay? And the tails point posteriorly. So I know now that this one is the right lateral ventricle because this tail is pointing posteriorly, okay? So then this one is the left lateral ventricle because this tail is pointing posteriorly, and I can now orient this ventricle model, okay? All right. Okay. Well, that's the right lateral ventricle and the left lateral ventricle. The third ventricle is right here where I'm putting my fingers, okay? All right, and in that area, there's a little hole that I just put the stick in. Now remember, in real life, that hole would be full of actual brain tissue that I've dissolved away with acid. Do you know something in the midline that it would be brain tissue right in the midline? What are you thinking, Jennifer?
That intermediate.
Yeah. That's where that intermediate mass is, in between the 2 lobes of the thalamus, right? Okay, so if I put my fingers here and you pretended that the tips of my fingers were little tiny eggs, okay, then that's where my thalamus would be, right? So the 2 lobes of the thalamus have the 3rd ventricle in between them, the space full of cerebrospinal fluid, right? Okay, so what's hard about wrapping your head around this?
Well, I don't know what the name was that you're talking about.
Of the intermediate mass?
No, of that.
This is this whole thing where my fingers are, or where I'm putting the stick. This is the 3rd ventricle.
Oh, it does. It's just called.
It's just called the 3rd ventricle. There are 4 ventricles in your brain, and so we've talked about the first 3. This is the right lateral ventricle. This is the left lateral ventricle, and this in the midline is my 3rd ventricle, okay? But it's a landmark because I know that the 2 lobes of the thalamus are on both sides of that 3rd ventricle because I can see the place where that intermediate mass went through, okay? Is that better?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, all right. So stop me when you don't understand. It makes no sense. And it's this weird diamond-shaped ventricle right here, okay? All right, so I say weird diamond shape. Can you make out the strange diamond shape? Because that's going to be an important thing to recognize when you're looking at charts and models. So that's my 4th ventricle, okay? All right, so now let's talk about what's inside my ventricles? Cerebrospinal fluid. And that is made with the help of your ependymal cells that line these ventricles, right? Mm-hmm. So they have cilia that are always beating that cerebrospinal fluid downward, okay? All right, so the cerebrospinal fluid of your right lateral ventricle is actually made in this bundle of capillaries. It's just this red stuff on the bottom of the right lateral ventricle. This is called the choroid plexus of the right lateral ventricle. So this is a bundle of capillaries that the plasma from the blood in this capillaries is going to be filtered through your ependymal cells and then go into the center of this right lateral ventricle, and that's how I get cerebrospinal fluid, okay? All right, so this choroid plexus, with the help of the ependymal cells, is what makes cerebrospinal fluid in this right lateral ventricle. Well, if you're looking underneath, you can see that I have a choroid plexus of my left lateral ventricle too, right? And so its job is to help make the ependymal cells make the cerebrospinal fluid. And look at my 3rd ventricle. In this case, the choroid plexus of the 3rd ventricle is on top of the 3rd ventricle, okay? And again, it has the same function. It is helping the ependymal cells make that cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? Oh, and look at this fourth ventricle. What would you call that red stuff? The choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, because I have a separate choroid plexus for each that is associated with each ventricle, right? Okay, all right. Okay, so now let's talk about how that cerebral spinal fluid is going to get from the right and left lateral ventricles down to the third, because the cilia that line those ventricles always pushing it downward, right? Okay, all right. So in between my right and left, in between my left lateral ventricle and my third ventricle, do you see where my stick is? There's a little tiny hole, a little tiny canal, a little tiny space here that allows cerebral spinal fluid to go from my left lateral ventricle to my third ventricle. And this is called the left interventricular foramen. Okay? Now you might remember foramen means hole, and you might be saying there's no hole there, but there is a hole there. It's just been filled with gray plastic, right? Okay, so it's just this little tunnel leading from my left lateral ventricle to my third ventricle. Likewise, between my right lateral ventricle and the third ventricle, I have another little hole. What do you suppose I'm going to call that? This is going to be the right. You're looking at it from behind. The right interventricular foramen, between the ventricles, right? Interventricular. Okay?
So is it the tube that's connecting?
And the choroid plexus of my third ventricle is going to continue to make CSF, okay? And it's going to send it down here to my fourth ventricle by way of this big passageway that I'm putting my stick on. And this is called the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct, okay? So I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, and I remember this because there's a lot of aqueducts in Yuma, Arizona, and there's nothing cerebral about Yuma, Arizona. So that's how I always remember cerebral aqueduct, okay? All right, that's how cerebral spinal fluid flows through all of these ventricles, okay? So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you over to this